Lidice did nothing wrong. That didn't stop German soldiers from surrounding the Czech village on June 10th, 1942, shooting every man and boy by nightfall and shipping the women off to a concentration camp where dozens of them would die. Then, over the following months, the Nazis set out to erase the village itself. They burned every house, demolished the church, dug up the 600-year-old cemetery, uprooted the orchards, rerouted the stream, and plowed the ruins beneath open fields. Their orders were not simply to punish the people who lived there. They were to make it impossible to prove the village had ever existed at all. And here is the part that makes this one of the most chilling war crimes of the Second World War. Lidice had no involvement in the act it was destroyed to avenge. Investigators never found a shred of evidence connecting Lidice to it. No weapons, no resistance, just a stranger's love letter, misread by the wrong person at the wrong time. 5 days earlier, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most powerful and feared men in Nazi Germany, had died from wounds inflicted by Czech resistance fighters in Prague. Adolf Hitler demanded a reprisal so devastating that it would terrorize an entire occupied nation. But the choice of which community would pay was not based on evidence. It was not based on a captured resistance network or a successful Gestapo investigation. It was shaped by a false lead, a love letter written to conceal an affair, and the simple fact that 2 young men from the village were serving with the Czechoslovak forces in Britain. None of it connected Lidice to the assassination. It did not matter. To understand why Lidice was destroyed, you first have to understand the man whose death set it in motion. In March 1939, German troops marched into what remained of Czechoslovakia, a year after the Munich Agreement had already stripped away its border defenses and handed them to Germany without a shot fired. Hitler renamed the Czech heartland the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and placed it under direct German administration. The country's own government was reduced to a puppet administration. Its universities shut down after student protests in November 1939, and hundreds of students shipped to concentration camps as a warning to the rest. Even so, for the first 2 years of occupation, the region was governed with something close to caution. Bohemia and Moravia held some of the most productive heavy industry anywhere under German control, including the enormous Škoda works, and its skilled workforce was building tanks, artillery, and aircraft components that the Wehrmacht could not easily replace. Berlin could not afford open rebellion in a place that was, in practical terms, one of the largest arms factories in Europe. So the occupation applied pressure carefully, tolerating slowdowns and quiet sabotage that in Poland would have been answered with mass shootings. That changed in September 1941 when Hitler sent Reinhard Heydrich to Prague to take control. Heydrich was 37 years old and already one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. As head of the Reich Main Security Office, he commanded the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the SS intelligence service. Just 5 months before arriving in Prague on January 20th, 1942, he had chaired a meeting at a lakeside villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, gathering 15 senior Nazi and government officials to lay out the administrative machinery for what the regime called the final solution, the coordinated deportation and murder of Europe's Jewish population across an entire continent. Heydrich was not a man who ordered atrocities from a distance and let others work out the details. He was the one who built the system that carried them out, the record-keeping, the transport schedule, the chain of command, all of it. In Prague, he governed exactly the same way. Within days of arriving, he declared martial law, had the Czech Prime Minister arrested, and pushed dozens of resistance figures through summary courts that handed down death sentences on the same day the trials opened. In his first weeks alone, hundreds of people were executed or sent to camps. But Heydrich understood something his predecessor had not, and it made him far more dangerous than a simple executioner. Alongside the killings, he increased fat rations and shoe allocations for Czech industrial workers, expanded workplace welfare programs, and arranged holiday resorts for select factory employees. It was a deliberate strategy, terror aimed precisely at the intelligentsia and the resistance, calculated generosity aimed at the labor force that kept the tanks rolling off the line. Divide the population, reward the productive, and destroy anyone who organizes. It worked. Factory absenteeism, previously a quiet form of protest, collapsed almost overnight. Strikes stopped. The intelligence networks that had been feeding information to the Czechoslovak government in exile in London were dismantled, cell by cell, and by early 1942, the flow of information to London had slowed to almost nothing. Within the SS itself, Heydrich earned nicknames that carried both fear and a strange, backhanded respect. The Butcher of Prague, the Blonde Beast, and most simply, the Hangman. Even Heinrich Himmler, technically his superior, was said to be uneasy in his presence. In London, President Edvard Beneš and his government in exile watched Heydrich's efficiency with mounting alarm. Their resistance networks inside the Protectorate were being unraveled one arrest at a time, and with them, the flow of intelligence that justified their government's existence to Britain and the Allies. Beneš needed something that would prove, unmistakably, that Czechoslovakia was still fighting, not merely waiting out the war from exile. His intelligence chiefs settled on something audacious: kill Heydrich in the heart of his own capital, under his own occupation. The operation was given the code name Anthropoid. 2 soldiers were selected to carry it out: Jozef Gabčík, a Slovak, and Jan Kubiš, a Czech, both of whom had fled the country after the German invasion and made their way into the exile army abroad. Britain's Special Operations Executive trained them for months in weapons, explosives, and close-quarters combat, then flew them back toward occupied territory in a converted bomber. On the night of December 28, 1941, they parachuted into the snow outside Prague, into a country where a single wrong word to the wrong neighbor could mean the end. They were not the only team dropped that winter. Alongside Gabčík and Kubiš, British aircraft delivered several other Czechoslovak units into the Protectorate onto parallel missions. Among them, a small radio unit codenamed Silver A, whose job was to keep London supplied with intelligence gathered on the ground. None of those men could have known it yet, but the transmitter they carried into hiding would, within months, help seal the fate of a second village almost nobody outside the region had ever heard of. For the next 5 months, Gabčík and Kubiš lived almost entirely in the shadows, moving between safe houses, relying on a small network of Czech families and, eventually, the priests of an Orthodox church in the city center to keep them fed, hidden, and alive. Some resistance leaders already inside the Protectorate reportedly pushed back against the plan when they learned of it, warning London through coded messages that killing a man of Heydrich's rank would bring reprisals unlike anything the country had yet endured. Reprisals the underground network on the ground, not the government sitting safely in London, would be the ones to absorb. Beneš and his intelligence service ordered the operation to proceed regardless. The political value of the act, to a government in exile that needed the world to see Czechoslovakia as a fighting ally rather than a defeated province waiting out the war from a distance, outweighed the risk to the people who would actually live under the consequences. Gabčík and Kubiš spent the following week studying Heydrich's daily routine. Each morning, he made the same 15-minute drive from his residence outside the city to Prague Castle, and each morning that route ran through a sharp hairpin curve in the Liben district, a corner tight enough that even a fast driver had to slow to a crawl. Heydrich, characteristically, refused to travel with a full security escort. He believed, correctly about almost everything else, that the population of the Protectorate was too broken to strike back at him directly. He was wrong about that one thing. And on the morning of May 27, 1942, 2 men were already waiting for him at that curve. The morning began like any other. Heydrich's open-topped Mercedes pulled away from his residence at Panenske Brzezany on schedule, with only a driver beside him. No armed escort, no second vehicle. Just a man who had grown so certain of his own invincibility that he treated Prague like a city already conquered in every sense that mattered. At the hairpin curve in Lieben, the car slowed to take the turn, exactly as it had every morning for months. Jozef Gabčík stepped into the road, raised a British-issue Sten submachine gun at point-blank range, and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun jammed. For one impossible second, Heydrich and his would-be assassin simply looked at each other over the barrel of a gun that would not fire. Then Heydrich, instead of ordering his driver to speed away and put the whole encounter behind him, made the decision that would end his life. He stood up in the moving car and drew his own pistol, determined to shoot the man who had just tried to kill him rather than simply escape. As the car slowed further, Jan Kubiš stepped out from where he had been waiting on the opposite side of the street and threw a modified anti-tank grenade toward the vehicle. It struck the rear wheel and exploded, tearing through the car's bodywork and driving fragments of metal and fibers torn loose from the seat upholstery deep into Heydrich's side. For a moment, chaos. Heydrich staggered from the wreckage, still holding his pistol, chased his attacker a short distance down the street, and then collapsed. Gabčík and Kubiš escaped separately on bicycles into the crowded streets of Prague, melting into a city that, within hours, would be sealed off, block by block, in the largest manhunt the Protectorate had ever seen. Heydrich was rushed to Bulovka Hospital. At first, the wounds did not appear to be fatal. Surgeons removed his spleen and several fragments of shrapnel and debris. Himmler, alarmed, sent his own personal physician from Berlin to oversee the recovery. For several days, the reports out of the hospital were almost optimistic. Heydrich's fever came and went. He was said to be resting, even joking with his nurses. Then, on June 3rd, his condition turned. What doctors at the time diagnosed as blood poisoning, almost certainly sepsis from the debris still lodged near his wounds, spread through his body faster than his physicians could counter it. Reinhard Heydrich died in the early hours of June 4, 1942, 8 days after the ambush, one of the very few senior Nazi officials killed by direct resistance action anywhere in occupied Europe during the entire war. Berlin's reaction was immediate and enormous. Hitler was reportedly incandescent, and his first instinct was almost unthinkable in scale. He floated the idea of executing 10,000 Czech civilians as blanket retribution. Karl Hermann Frank, the senior SS and police official running day-to-day affairs in the Protectorate, flew to Berlin to argue against it, not on moral grounds, but on practical ones. Bohemia and Moravia were among the most productive industrial regions still under German control, and a mass slaughter on that scale risked crippling war production the Reich could not afford to lose. Hitler scaled back the number, but not the intent. Someone, somewhere, was going to answer for Heydrich's death in blood, and it would not be a quiet reckoning. Even in the days between the attack and Heydrich's actual death, the killing had already begun. Martial law was imposed across the Protectorate within hours of the ambush. Prague was locked down, street by street, in what became the largest search operation of the entire occupation, with tens of thousands of German troops and police checking identity papers house by house through the night. At least 157 people connected, however loosely, to suspected resistance activity were executed in the first week alone. A wave of preemptive terror meant to demonstrate that the Reich's patience had already run out before its most important investigation had barely started. Radio broadcasts across the Protectorate delivered the terms plainly. Anyone hiding the assassins, or anyone who knew something and failed to report it, would be shot alongside their entire family. An enormous financial reward was offered for information.
Na dopadení pachatelů se vypisuje odměna 10 milionů korun.
Thousands of tips eventually arrived at police stations, and virtually none of them were worth anything. because almost nobody in the country actually knew where the two men were. The people who did know, a small circle of families and clergy in Prague, said nothing. In Prague itself, the propaganda machine moved almost as quickly as the death squads. Within days, officials had renamed 19 streets, squares, and parks across the city after Heydrich, plastering his name over a capital that had, only a week earlier, watched two men nearly kill him with a homemade grenade. On June 9th, Berlin staged an elaborate state funeral for its fallen official, with Hitler himself delivering the eulogy and famously calling him the man with the iron heart. It was choreographed down to the last black-draped column to project total, unshakable German power. But behind the ceremony, the actual killers were still free. The manhunt was going nowhere, and the Gestapo in Prague was under enormous pressure to produce someone, anyone, to punish. That same day, hundreds of miles from the funeral hall in Berlin, a letter that had been sitting in a Gestapo file for weeks was about to decide the fate of a village nobody in the German High Command had ever heard of. The Gestapo's investigation into Heydrich's assassination was, by early June, a machine running almost entirely on fear rather than evidence. Thousands of Czechs had been arrested. Hundreds had already been executed, and still, nobody had produced a credible lead on where Gabčík and Kubiš were actually hiding. Weeks earlier, in the town of Slany near Kladno, a factory owner named Jaroslav Pála had come into possession of a letter written by one of his workers, a young miner named Václav Žiha, to a woman named Anna Maruščáková, who was employed at his factory. The letter was not what it appeared to be. Žiha, married and desperate to end a secret affair without confessing the truth, had invented a dramatic story to frighten Maruščáková into breaking things off, hinting that he was mixed up in dangerous resistance activity connected to the assassination and needed her to provide him a false alibi. It was, in reality, nothing more than a lie told to escape an inconvenient romance. Pála did not know that. Reading a letter that seemed to reference the underground and the attack on Heydrich, he did what fear demanded of nearly everyone in the Protectorate that spring. He handed it to the Gestapo. Investigators in Kladno pulled the thread. Interrogation, under conditions that made false confession almost inevitable, led them from Žiha to the fact that he had sent regards, in that same letter, to a family in the nearby village of Lidice. That family was the Horaks, and the Horaks had a son, Jozef, serving with the Czechoslovak forces in Britain, alongside another Lidice man, Jozef Stříbrný, both of them airmen who had escaped the country years earlier to join the fight from abroad. To a Gestapo desperate for any concrete target, this was enough. A village with sons in the Royal Air Force, mentioned, however tangentially, in a letter connected to the assassination investigation. Agents were dispatched to Lidice. They searched the village from one end to the other, tearing through homes, barns, and outbuildings looking for weapons, a hidden radio transmitter, anything that would tie this quiet farming community of just over 500 people to the men who had killed Heydrich. They found nothing. No weapons, no transmitter, no evidence that a single resident of Lidice had ever had any contact with Gabčík, Kubiš, or the broader resistance network at all. It did not matter. On June 9th, the same day Berlin buried Heydrich with full state honors, Hitler gave the order. Lidice was to be annihilated, its male population executed, its women and children deported, and the village itself wiped from existence as a warning to the entire Protectorate. The order traveled down the chain of command with unsettling speed. Karl Hermann Frank telephoned Horst Böhmer, the commander of the security police and SD in Prague, and instructed him to carry it out. Böhmer drove to Kladno to brief the local Gestapo office, whose commander, Harold Wiesmann, had been running the district since 1939 with such a heavy hand that locals reportedly called him the God of Kladno. What Wiesmann described in his own post-war testimony is one of the most revealing exchanges in the entire case. According to his account, Burma arrived and announced that Frank had ordered the total destruction of Lidice and of a second village roughly 15 kilometers away, on the claim that the parachutists had spent a night there. Wiesmann, by his own telling, asked how this was justified. Burma's answer was as close to a summary of Nazi reprisal doctrine as anything in the historical record. It was justified, and he did not need to ask how. The second village, in the end, was spared. Böhm telephoned Frank again, and between them they concluded that only the destruction of Lidice could be defended. Not on the evidence, which was identical in both cases, meaning effectively non-existent, but on whatever internal calculation of appearances and paperwork satisfied two men deciding, over a phone line, how many communities would cease to exist that week. One village lived because of a conversation, the other did not. By some accounts, German investigators had already begun to suspect the letter pointed to an entirely different village of the same name elsewhere in the region, a mundane coincidence rather than a genuine link. It no longer mattered. Berlin had already been told, the order had already been given, and reversing course was, in the brutal calculus of the Nazi state, less useful than simply proceeding. There is a version of this story where careful investigation clears an innocent village, and the Gestapo moves on to a genuine lead. That is not what happened. What happened is that a jealous lie filtered through a terrified factory owner, an overworked interrogation unit, and a regime that had already decided someone would burn for Heydrich's death, regardless of what the evidence actually showed, sealed the fate of 500 people who had never done anything at all. Václav Žiha and Anna Maruščáková, the two people whose secret affair and its clumsy cover story had set the entire chain of events in motion, did not escape the machine they had accidentally triggered either. Both were arrested, and that October, months after Lidice had already ceased to exist, both were executed at Mauthausen concentration camp, a final, almost administrative tying off of a loose end in a story the Gestapo had no interest in leaving open, even after it no longer served any purpose at all. By the evening of June 9th, trucks were already moving toward a village most Germans and most Czechs outside the immediate region had never even heard of. Lidice, in the early hours of June 10th, 1942, was a village that had existed for roughly 600 years, first mentioned in written records around the year 1300. It had survived the Hussite Wars. It had survived the 30 Years' War. It had survived, more recently, the German occupation of 1939, with nothing more remarkable happening to it than to any other rural community in the Protectorate. Its 503 residents worked mostly in farming and in the coal mines around nearby Chełmno, and its most distinctive local feature was its cherry orchards, planted along the edges of its fields, the kind of quiet, unremarkable place that exists in the background of history until, for a few hours, it does not. The force assembled to destroy it had gathered in Chełmno the previous evening. Gestapo agents from Prague, joined by 2 companies of uniformed police troops and a security police squad under the command of an SS captain named Max Rostock. They traveled the short distance to Lidice by truck, bus, and staff car. Just after midnight, they surrounded the entire perimeter of the village, sealing off every road and setting up checkpoints on every exit before a single resident knew anything was happening. There would be no escape, and there would be no warning. Anyone who tried to leave and anyone who happened to arrive during the operation was simply absorbed into it. Families were pulled from their beds and herded into the village square, some still in their night clothes. Lidice consisted of just over 100 family houses, which meant the entire operation could be conducted with the tidiness of a census. Gestapo agents worked from typed lists, checking names against the household registry as they went, splitting families apart with the flat efficiency of men processing paperwork rather than human beings. Valuables were confiscated and inventoried. Livestock was noted for later removal. Men and boys aged 15 and older were separated from the women and younger children and marched to the outbuildings of a local farm belonging to the Heydrich family. the very family whose supposed connection to the assassination had doomed the entire village in the first place. They were locked inside under armed guard through the remaining hours of darkness. At dawn, the killing began. Soldiers hung mattresses against the outer wall of a barn to prevent bullets from ricocheting back toward the firing squad, an almost bureaucratic touch of precaution amid an act with no precaution in it at all. Men were led out in groups of 10, lined against the wall and shot, then the next 10, and the next. The youngest among them had turned 15 only days earlier. The oldest was in his 80s. Fathers were shot alongside sons, brothers alongside brothers, in an operation that made no distinction between a miner, a farmer, a school teacher, and a boy who had not yet finished growing. At some point during the morning, German officers ordered the group size increased to speed the process along because the original pace was taking too long. It continued through the morning and into the afternoon, a grim, methodical rhythm that did not stop until 173 men and boys lay dead in the yard of a farm that belonged to their neighbors. German cameramen were on hand throughout, filming silent newsreel footage of trucks, of soldiers, of the empty streets, material that Berlin intended purely as a record of German efficiency for internal use. It would resurface years later in a courtroom neither the cameramen nor their superiors could have imagined at the time. The village's Catholic priest, Jozef Stemberger, was reportedly offered his own life if he would calm his congregation and help the process along without incident. He refused and died with the rest of his parish. The killing was not finished, even then. In the days that followed, another group of men, mostly local miners who had been at work in Chełmno and missed the initial roundup, were tracked down and executed separately in Prague. Several relatives of the Heydrich and Stříbrný families, already held in custody for the crime of having sons serving with the Allies abroad, were executed alongside them. By the time the reprisal ran its course, the total number of Lidice men and boys killed reached 192. There is a bitter irony buried in that number. The two men whose service records had, indirectly and falsely, triggered the entire massacre, Jozef Heydrich and Jozef Stříbrný, survived the war. They were already safely in Britain, flying for the RAF, hundreds of miles from the farmyard, where their neighbors were dying in their name. Almost the only adult man from Lidice who escaped execution outright was a resident named František Seidl, who had been in prison since 1938 on an unrelated matter and did not even learn what had happened to his village until his release that December. While the shots echoed from the Heydrich farm through the morning of June 10th, a very different and, in its own way, even crueler process was already underway less than half a mile down the road, where the women and children of Lidice waited in the village schoolhouse, not yet knowing that most of them would never see their homes, or in many cases, each other, again. 203 women and 105 children were held together in the village school that morning, close enough to hear the gunfire, but not yet told what it meant. From there, they were loaded onto trucks and driven to a grammar school in nearby Chełmno, where they were confined for 3 days while German officials decided what would become of them. It was inside that building that families were finally, deliberately torn apart. Children were separated from their mothers by Gestapo officials working from the same cold administrative logic that had governed everything else about the operation. 4 women who were pregnant at the time were sent, under guard, to a hospital in Prague, the same hospital where Reinhard Heydrich had died only days earlier and forced to undergo abortions before being deported to concentration camps along with the rest. The remaining women were put on trains bound for Ravensbrück, a concentration camp built specifically for women north of Berlin. Conditions there were brutal, even by the standards of the Nazi camp system. Forced labor in nearby factories and workshops, starvation rations that shrank further as the war dragged on, and medical neglect, including cruel pseudo-medical experimentation on other prisoners that killed inmates as efficiently as any firing squad, just more slowly. Over the following 3 years, 60 of the women deported from Lidice died inside Ravensbrück's walls. When Allied forces finally liberated the camp in the spring of 1945, 143 of Lidice's women were still alive to return home, many of them not knowing whether their children had survived at all. The fate of the children was, if anything, more calculated and more horrifying. 8 infants under a year old were separated out immediately and taken to a hospital in Prague to be placed with German families and raised without any knowledge of where they had come from. The remaining children, roughly 99 of them, were loaded onto a train and taken to a disused textile factory in the Polish city of Łódź, then under German occupation, where they were held in bare conditions with almost no food, no beds, and no explanation of what had happened to their parents. There, they were examined, not by doctors concerned with their welfare, but by SS race officials trained to assess whether a child's physical features, hair color, eye color, bone structure met the regime's pseudo-scientific standard for what it called racial suitability. It was, in every sense, an audition for survival conducted by men measuring skulls. Lidice's children were far from the only ones subjected to this process. Across occupied Eastern Europe, the same office responsible for screening them ran a program that would eventually pull tens of thousands of children away from their families for the same reason, judged useful enough to be raised as Germans and erased from their own heritage in every way except blood. A small number of Lidice's children, roughly 17, were judged suitable for what the Nazis termed Germanization. They were sent to live with German families inside the Reich, given new German names, forbidden from speaking Czech, and in many cases actively taught to forget where they had come from. A Lidice girl named Marie, 9 years old at the time, was renamed Ingeborg and raised by a German family in occupied Poland, later recalling in a post-war interview that she and the other selected children had been chosen specifically because they had the blonde hair and light eyes the regime considered easiest to pass off as authentically German. The rest, a group of roughly 88 children, including at least one who was shot while attempting to run during the initial roundup, were not judged useful to the Reich in any way. In July of 1942, they were transported to the Chełmno extermination camp in occupied Poland and killed, most of them inside mobile gas vans, machinery built for exactly this purpose and already in grim, routine use as part of the broader machinery of the Holocaust that Heydrich himself had helped design at Wannsee only months before his death. After the war, the newly restored Czechoslovak government launched a painstaking search across the former Reich, combing through orphanages, German households, and adoption records, trying to locate and repatriate every Lidice child who might still be alive under an assumed German name. Posters went up across occupied Germany, carrying a single question on behalf of the survivors. The women of Lidice are asking you, where are our children? Captured Gestapo personnel were interrogated. Transport records were traced. For a long time, nobody on the Czechoslovak side even knew for certain what had happened to the group sent to Łódź, because the paperwork documenting their final destination had not yet surfaced. It took more than 2 years to account for them all. Of the 105 children taken from Lidice that June, only 17 were ever found and brought home. The last of them, an 8-year-old boy named Václav Zelenka, returned in 1947, so young when he was taken and so thoroughly raised as German in the years since that he had almost no memory of the village he came from and had to be taught, again, that he was Czech. The people of Lidice were gone, its men shot in a farmyard, its women scattered through a concentration camp 400 kilometers away, its children murdered or renamed into someone else's family, some of them so young they would grow up with no memory of ever having been Czech at all. And still, in Berlin, that was not considered a complete enough reprisal, because the goal had never been simply to punish the people of Lidice. The goal was to make the place itself stop existing. The village, its houses, its graves, its orchards, the very ground it stood on, still had to be made to disappear. Why go to the trouble? The men were dead. The village was empty. From a purely practical standpoint, the reprisal was complete, and the buildings themselves could have been handed to German settlers, used for storage, or simply left to rot. What happened instead over the following months was in its own quiet way as chilling as the killings, because it was not driven by rage. It was driven by policy. Once the executions were complete and the deportations underway, German units set the empty houses of Lidice on fire. When the flames had done their work, engineering crews moved in with explosives to bring down whatever walls were still standing, then followed with heavy equipment to flatten the rubble into the ground. The village church was destroyed along with everything else. Soldiers dug up the village cemetery, a burial ground that had held the dead of Lidice for centuries, and removed the remains entirely, leaving no trace that generations of families had ever been laid to rest there. This was not a single afternoon's work. Demolishing an entire village down to bare soil took months, carried out largely by units of the Reich Labor Service and, later, by forced laborers brought in from a concentration camp, men set to work erasing a place whose people had already been erased. Photographs and film taken during the process show German officers standing on hills of broken masonry, surveying the progress the way a supervisor inspects a construction site, because that, functionally, is what it was to them, a project with a scope, a schedule, and a completion date. The destruction extended even to the landscape itself. A small pond where village children had once played was filled in. The stream running through Lidice was rerouted, its natural course erased along with everything else. The cherry orchards that had given the village its quiet local character were uprooted tree by tree. A fence went up around the entire area with warnings to keep out, as if the emptiness itself needed guarding. German state radio broadcast the news of what had happened, not as something to hide, but as a deliberate act of psychological warfare aimed at the rest of the protectorate. The men of Lidice had been shot, the announcement explained, the women sent to a camp, and the children handed over for re-education. Officials went further, declaring publicly that the very name of the community had been struck from the record, wiped from German maps and administrative registers, as though it had never been assigned a name at all. The same cameramen who had filmed the roundup on June 10th were sent back in the following weeks to document the demolition itself, footage intended as a private record of German thoroughness. Proof for internal files that an order given had been an order fully carried out, brick by brick and grave by grave. The following year, the flattened ground where Lidice had stood was ploughed under and planted with crops, transformed into ordinary farmland as though nothing had ever occupied that soil. It was erasure treated as a bureaucratic task, the same cold, procedural mindset that had built the concentration camp system now turned toward wiping a rural Czech village off the earth so completely that a visitor passing through a year later might never have known it was there at all. This was the logic at the center of Nazi reprisal policy, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The killing was not the end of the punishment. The killing was only the first step. The final goal was to make the place itself vanish, to deny the dead even the dignity of a marked grave or a name on a map, so that memory itself would have nowhere left to attach. It did not work. But at the time, in June of 1942, nobody could have known that yet because the men who had actually pulled the trigger on Reinhard Heydrich were still alive, still hiding in Prague, and the manhunt for them was only weeks away from claiming one more village. While the ground of Lidice was still being leveled, the hunt for Gabčík, Kubiš, and their support network continued to close in from an entirely different direction. Among the resistance operatives still active in the region was a smaller team codenamed Silver A, tasked with maintaining radio contact between Czech resistance cells and London. Their transmitter, moved repeatedly for safety, had by the spring of 1942 come to rest near a tiny settlement of stone cutters called Ležáky, close to the city of Pardubice. It was a community of only a handful of houses and a mill, home to fewer than 40 people. The break the Gestapo needed came, in the end, not from clever detective work, but from betrayal. Karel Čurda, another Czech operative who had parachuted into the country as part of a separate resistance mission, had spent weeks watching the reprisals unfold with mounting terror, and reportedly grew convinced that his own family, or an entire town, would eventually be destroyed in his place if the assassins were never found. On June 16th, driven by some mixture of fear and the promise of an enormous financial reward, Čurda walked into Gestapo headquarters in Prague and began naming names. His information led first to the discovery of the Silver A radio operation, the same team that had parachuted into the country alongside Gabčík and Kubiš back in December, and its connection to Ležáky, where the group's transmitter had been hidden inside the double ceiling of a stone quarry building since that spring. Silver A's own commander took his own life, rather than be captured once he realized the network had been exposed. On June 24, 1942, just 2 weeks after Lidice, roughly 500 German security troops surrounded the settlement. Ležáky was smaller than Lidice, home to only a few dozen people scattered across 8 houses and a mill, but the reprisal followed an identical script. Every adult resident, 33 men and women in total, was rounded up and shot that same night at a police barracks in nearby Pardubice. The houses were burned to the ground and later bulldozed, just as Lidice's had been. Of the 13 children taken from Ležáky, most were sent, like the children of Lidice, to their deaths at Chełmno. Only 2 young sisters survived the war, selected for Germanization, and eventually found and returned afterward. Ležáky received almost none of the international attention Lidice would go on to receive, and remains, even today, the far lesser known of the 2 villages the Nazis erased that June. Čurda's betrayal also gave the Gestapo something even more valuable: the location where Gabčík, Kubiš, and several of their fellow operatives had been hiding for weeks. The crypt beneath the Orthodox Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius on Reslova Street in the heart of Prague, sheltered there with the help of the church's own clergy. On June 18th, some 700 SS and police troops surrounded the building. Inside were not only Gabčík and Kubiš, but 5 more resistance fighters who had joined them in hiding over the preceding weeks: Jozef Bublik, Jan Hruby, Adolf Opalka, Jaroslav Schwarz, and Jozef Walčík, men from other parachute missions who had converged on the same hiding place as the net closed around Prague. What followed was a battle unlike almost anything else in the history of the wartime resistance in Europe. A running firefight through the nave of a church as the paratroopers, vastly outnumbered and effectively out of any hope of escape, fought back with pistols and grenades against a force equipped with machine guns. Jan Kubiš was fatally wounded in the exchange. The surviving fighters retreated into the crypt below, a stone chamber with only a single narrow vent to the street above, and held out for hours as German forces tried to flush them out, first by force, then by flooding the crypt with fire hoses, and finally with tear gas. As the assault dragged into its final hours, with ammunition nearly spent and no possibility of escape, Gabčík and the remaining men chose to take their own lives rather than surrender. The clergy who had sheltered them were arrested in the aftermath and executed. Karel Čurda collected his reward, later married, changed his name, and lived under Nazi protection for the remainder of the war. It would not save him. Arrested after Czechoslovakia's liberation and tried for treason, he was hanged at Pankrak prison in Prague on April 29, 1947. The full scale of the reprisal campaign that followed Heydrich's death is difficult to state precisely, but the accepted figures run into the thousands. Beyond Lidice and Ležáky, entire families connected to the resistance were arrested and executed, including relatives of the paratroopers themselves, most of them killed at Mauthausen later that year. The debate over whether Operation Anthropoid was worth its cost began almost immediately and has never fully ended. It achieved exactly what Benish wanted politically, prompting Britain and France to formally repudiate the Munich Agreement and restoring Czechoslovakia's standing as a fighting allied nation. It also cost thousands of lives that the men who ordered it from London would never have to answer for personally. The men who had killed Heydrich were dead. The traitor who betrayed them had been paid and would eventually answer for it. But by the time the last shots echoed through that crypt on Reslova Street, the story of what had happened at Lidice 2 weeks earlier was no longer something Germany could keep contained within its own borders. It was already crossing oceans, and the world was about to react in a way Berlin had not anticipated at all. The German regime's decision to broadcast the destruction of Lidice as a warning to the Protectorate turned out to be a catastrophic miscalculation, because the same radio announcement meant to terrify occupied Czechs instead handed international journalists a fully confirmed German-sourced account of a war crime.
Nachdem die Einwohner dieses Dorfes durch ihre Tätigkeit und durch die Unterstützung der Mörder von SS-Obergruppenführer Heydrich gegen die erlassenen Gesetze schärfstens verstoßen haben, sind die männlichen Erwachsenen erschossen, die Frauen in ein Konzentrationslager überführt und die Kinder einer geeigneten Erziehung zugeführt worden. Die Gebäude des Ortes sind dem Erdboden gleichgemacht und der Name der Gemeinde ist ausgelöscht worden.
Within days, wire services had picked up the story, and it was running in newspapers across Britain, the United States, and the wider Allied world. The reaction was immediate and intense. Allied propaganda ministries had spent 3 years fighting an uphill battle against public skepticism, because the First World War had left a generation of readers convinced that atrocity stories were routinely invented for morale purposes. Lidice was different. Here was a case that needed no exaggeration and no embellishment, because the source was Germany itself, announcing what it had done as an act of policy. The facts alone, an entire village erased, its men executed, its children taken, its name struck from the map, were horrifying enough on their own, and they arrived stamped with German authorship. Poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, one of the most celebrated literary voices in America, was commissioned to write a long narrative poem on the massacre, broadcast nationally on NBC radio that October, and later published in book form, one of the most widely distributed pieces of wartime writing to come out of the entire war on the home front. Communities around the world responded in a way no German ministry could have predicted. They began renaming themselves after the village Hitler had tried to erase. In Illinois, the town of Stern Park Gardens voted to rename itself Lidice that same year, believed to be the first place in the world to do so. A suburb of Mexico City took the name San Jeronimo Lidice, a name it still carries today, along with an annual commemoration. A town in Panama was renamed Lidice in 1943. Neighborhoods and streets bearing the name appeared in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Bulgaria, and in Chile, scattered across 4 continents by people who had never set foot in Bohemia but understood exactly what the name now stood for. Even the English city of Coventry, itself gutted by German bombing raids 2 years earlier, dedicated a public square to Lidice, one devastated community reaching out to acknowledge another. The most enduring response came from an unlikely source, a mining community in Stoke-on-Trent, England. In September 1942, a local physician and counsellor named Barnett Stross, working with the North Staffordshire Miners' Federation, launched a campaign under a slogan that directly answered a German declaration that Lidice would die forever. Stross's answer was blunt: Lidice shall live. Miners donated a share of their wages toward rebuilding the village after the war, in an act of working-class solidarity between 2 mining communities that had never met, raising a fund that would be worth roughly £1 million in today's money. Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš himself attended the campaign's launch. Justice, when it came, arrived through more formal channels. Nazi propaganda film footage of Lidice's destruction, originally shot to intimidate the Protectorate into submission, was later entered as evidence by Allied prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials, used to demonstrate the systematic, premeditated nature of Nazi war crimes to judges and to the world. Karl Hermann Frank, the senior SS and police official most directly responsible for ordering the destruction of both Lidice and Ležáky, was captured after the war, extradited to Czechoslovakia, and tried before the Prague People's Court in the spring of 1946. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and hanged in the courtyard of Pankrak prison on May 22, 1946, in front of a crowd of thousands, several rows of whom were filled with the surviving widows of the men he had ordered shot 4 years earlier. Frank was not the only one held to account. In April 1947, a People's Court in Prague tried 15 former Gestapo officials, specifically for their roles in the destruction of Lidice. Among them was Harold Wiesmann, the Chełmno Gestapo chief who had helped organize the operation, and whose post-war testimony had exposed so much of the chain of command behind it. Wiesmann was convicted and executed in Prague that same month. Max Rostock, the SS captain who commanded the troops that carried out the shootings at the Horak farm, was also captured, tried, and sentenced to death. Horst Boehmer, the man who had personally delivered Frank's order to Chełmno with the words that it was justified and nobody needed to ask how, never faced a courtroom at all. After Lidice, he went on to command an Einsatzgruppe operating in Belarus and the occupied Soviet Union, a unit responsible for the mass murder of civilians on a scale that dwarfed even the destruction of a village. He disappeared in the fighting around Königsberg in April 1945 and was later declared dead, one of many senior perpetrators for whom the war ended without a verdict. A separate reckoning played out at Nuremberg the following year in a subsequent trial against officials of the SS Race and Resettlement Main Office, the very office responsible for screening Lidice's children for Germanization. Two of those children, Marie Doležalová and Marie Hanfová, by then teenagers, took the stand as witnesses for the prosecution, describing in their own words what had been done to their families and their village. It was, in its own quiet way, an answer to everything the Nazi regime had tried to accomplish by erasing Lidice in the first place. The children it had tried to rename and reshape into someone else stood in an Allied courtroom instead, using their own names, telling their own story. Reconstruction began not long after. In 1947, work started on a new village of roughly 150 modern homes, built near but deliberately not on top of the site of the original Lidice, funded in part by donations from Stoke-on-Trent and from Czechoslovak communities abroad. The women and children who had survived Ravensbrück and Germanization slowly returned to homes that were, in every physical sense, brand new, built on the promise that the community itself, if not the original buildings, would go on. The original site, the fields where the village once stood, was left largely undisturbed and eventually became a memorial. A rose garden was planted between the old site and the new village, seeded with rose bushes donated from dozens of countries, another idea championed by Barnett Stross and the same British supporters who had refused to let the name die in 1942. Since 1967, the village has also hosted an international children's fine art exhibition, drawing submissions from young artists around the world, a deliberate act of turning a place defined by murdered children into one that gathers the work of living ones. Decades later, a Czech sculptor named Marie Ušitilova spent the last 20 years of her life creating something almost unbearable to look at directly. 82 life-sized bronze statues of children, one for each of the young victims sent to Chełmno, standing together in the open field where their homes used to be. She died in 1989 before the work was finished. Her husband completed the casting, and the full memorial was unveiled in the year 2000. Where trucks once rolled in under cover of darkness, there is now only grass, a museum, a rose garden, and 82 bronze children standing silently in a field, facing the empty horizon where a village used to be. Adolf Hitler wanted Lidice to disappear so completely that history itself would have nothing left to record. He very nearly got exactly that. For a few weeks in the summer of 1942, an entire community, 503 people who had built farms, raised families, and tended cherry orchards for 6 centuries, existed only in Gestapo files and in the memories of the handful who survived. What Hitler did not account for was the world's reaction to being told, in Germany's own words, broadcast over its own radio, exactly what had been done and why. He did not account for a jealous letter, a factory owner's fear, and a village with no real connection to any crime at all, becoming the very thing that exposed, more clearly than almost any other single incident, how arbitrary and how administrative Nazi terror truly was. Reprisal was never really about justice. It was never really about evidence. It was about demonstrating that any village, chosen for almost any reason or no reason at all, could be erased on command, and that demonstration was the entire point. The name Lidice now exists on maps in Illinois, in Mexico, in Panama, in Venezuela, in Brazil, on streets in Bulgaria and Chile, and on the rebuilt Czech village that stands today just a short walk from the field where the original once stood. None of that undoes what happened to the 192 men shot at the Horak farm, the 60 women who never came home from Ravensbrück, or the 88 children who were murdered simply because the Reich needed somewhere to point its anger. But it does mean the regime failed at the one thing it actually set out to accomplish that June. It tried to make Lidice vanish from history. Instead, it made the name impossible to separate from history at all. There is one more thing worth saying about Lidice, and it is the part that tends to unsettle people most. Nothing about the operation was chaotic. Nobody lost control. There was no mob, no frenzy, no moment where discipline broke down and something terrible happened by accident. Every stage of it, the phone call, the typed lists, the mattresses hung against the barn wall, the racial screening in Łódź, the demolition schedule, was carried out by men following procedure, filing reports, and going home afterward. Some of them were promoted for it. That is what the word systematic actually means when historians use it about the Third Reich. And Lidice is one of the clearest, smallest, most completely documented examples of it anywhere in the war. That, in the end, is the quiet warning underneath this story, one that has outlasted the men who gave the orders by nearly a century. Collective punishment does not require guilt. It only requires power and someone willing to use it against people who cannot fight back. Lidice was destroyed not because its people had done something wrong, but because a regime needed a village, any village, to prove a point about what it was capable of doing to anyone. Remembering exactly how thin, how arbitrary, and how administrative that decision really was, a rumor, a letter, a name on a list, is not a comfortable kind of history, but it may be the most necessary kind to keep telling. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.